Welcome back to Fossil Ridge Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about Hawkeye, specifically a Justice Aspect deck build. Here is the deck build. First, take all of the Hawkeye hero cards. Next, we're going to take our general resources, 1 copy of Energy, Genius, and Strength, 2 copies of the Power of Justice, and here's our sort of standard set of generic cards. We've got 1 copy of Downtime, 1 copy of Endurance, 1 Avengers Mansion, Helicarrier, and the Quinn Carrier. Next up, we're going to have 3 copies of Clear the Area, 2 copies of Counterintelligence, 3 copies of Beat Cop, 3 copies of For Justice. We're going to have a lot of allies in this deck. So we're going to have 1 copy of Nick Fury, Lockjaw, War Machine. Next, we're going to move on to our Justice allies. We have 1 copy of the Agent Coulson, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, and finally Spider-Man. Let's talk real quick about the opening hand / mulligan that you're going to begin the game with. So first and foremost, I think what makes Hawkeye pretty strong is this quiver. So you're going to be looking for his quiver early on in the game. If you can get his quiver out, Hawkeye's a really powerful hero. If you don't get the quiver out, it gets a little bit clunky, I think. Next up, we have Expert Marksman, and these are going to be sort of resource generating cards for arrow events. So it's pretty critical that you get these out. What I do like about this card, it's very, very cheap, very, very effective because there's so many arrows. There are 10 different arrows in the Hawkeye hero cards. Next up, and we've talked about this many, many times, get your basic resource cards, Helicarrier or Quinn Carrier, in your opening hand / mulligan, and it will prime your deck because you have resource generation. Next up is Survivability. Hawkeye is basically on the lower end when it comes to hit points. He only has 9. Now, there's not a lot of healing cards in this deck. There's not a lot of sort of hero-type cards in this deck that keep him alive, with the exception of Mockingbird. So if you get your Endurance card out, he's going to have 12 hit points total. Mockingbird is a great card that once you get it, you can sort of recycle her back and forth from your hand and back onto the table and have her soak up damage. But first and foremost, Hawkeye does have some problems with sustaining those long runs out in hero form due to the sort of lack of hit points. Now, you will have noticed that this deck is very sort of ally heavy. So there's 8 allies in the deck. So use your allies to help soak up damage and take some of those big villain hits. That's the key to survivability with this deck. Hawkeye's key is shooting and firing arrows. So obviously we've already talked about some of the resource generation cards. We have Expert Marksman, and there are going to be 2 copies of that in the deck. You can be looking for those. If you have 2 of those out, you can fire an arrow very easily. 6 of the arrows have a resource cost of 2. 4 of the arrows in the deck only have a resource cost of 1. So you can be firing pretty easily 2 arrows per turn once you have a decent amount of resources out on the table. Now, the key to sustaining a lot of this is the quiver. You're going to be using the quiver to look through your deck and keep sort of priming that flow of arrows going through your deck. So be a little bit more proactive. If you're starting to see maybe some threats piling up, you can look for certain arrows in the deck. Or if you're seeing maybe minions are building up, you can look for different arrows, or maybe you really need to take down the villain. You can look for those as well. Some of the arrows also, too, have the Stun and Confuse abilities on them, which I'll show you that pretty quickly. So really use the quiver to be proactive about the situation that's developing out on the table. Also to be mindful of the bow as well. So the bow is pretty cool. It does give Hawkeye a +1 to attack, and all of the attacks, arrow attacks, are considered ranged, which is great. I mean, there's not a ton of enemies with Retaliate, but there's enough of them that it is a good advantage and a good bonus. Here's a quick note about Hawkeye and his arrows. Hawkeye, in my opinion, is a really good sort of starter character. So if you're trying to get somebody into the game, I think Hawkeye's very consistent. It's the same sort of thing over and over again. You got 10 arrows in the deck, 2 of each copy. Basically, you have a bow, you're firing the arrows. You can fire about 2 per round if you have enough resources out on the table and you're cycling through your deck appropriately. But the note on Hawkeye is that pretty much all of his arrows deal damage with the exception of the cable arrow, which is just a threat sort of management arrow. So you're going to get consistent damage output from Hawkeye. So it makes it really stable, really easy for a new player to sort of get into the game. A lot of the other decks, some of them like Doctor Strange, that one might be a little bit more difficult for newer players. Thor, I think, would be fairly difficult for new players as well. But Hawkeye, think of it this way. If you want to get somebody into the game, use this deck. Very easy to learn. It's a very easy solo deck as well. So next up, we're going to get into some of the threat mitigation cards. The Justice aspect cards in this deck also provide consistency, specifically for solo and new players. Beat Cop is a fantastic card. Get 3 copies of that out. You can constantly be removing threat. Every turn, there's a newer card. It's called Clear the Area. This one's great too. Really low cost, only 1 resource. Get rid of 2 threats, and if it gets rid of the last threat on a scheme, then you get to draw a card. So that's a fantastic sort of addition to that. The next 2 are Counterintelligence and For Justice. These are 2 fairly basic threat mitigation cards, but they also add that consistency and that threat management to the game as well. Something that's great about this deck, if you want to tweak it a little bit, you can remove, a couple copies of the 2 copies of Counterintelligence or some of the Clear the Areas, and you could put in some more aggressive sort of Justice aspect cards. So feel free to do that if you want to, let's say, bolster or increase the damage output. There are several Justice aspect cards that when you get rid of a side scheme, you can damage an enemy, you can damage a minion. But for the most part, you'll see that threat management with this deck will be very, very easy. Then with the damage output of the arrows combined with this, it makes it just a very universal, easy deck to play, and you can handle a lot of different threats in both solo and multiplayer. Here are some closing thoughts on Hawkeye. First and foremost, he is a nice, versatile character that you can put a decent deck together with. So the high level of offense mixed with the Justice aspect cards makes it very versatile, easy to play. Secondarily, Hawkeye is a little bit squishy when it comes to surviving damage from villains with only 9 hit points to start. Make sure that you use a full complement of allies to keep you alive. Make sure that they're helping support him. Otherwise, he's going to get beat up and taken out of the game pretty quickly. Hopefully you've enjoyed this deck building idea. Hawkeye is a very, very easy character to play, so get your friends into the game, get your family members into the game by showing them how to play this deck. It's very, very easy, a great sort of intro deck to use with them. Once again, I want to thank you for your time, and as always, have fun gaming.